Tonight, the CEO who lost his job because of his association with the church, neo-Nazis in sport, and the gap between rich and poor that's killing democracy. Welcome to Q&A. Also tonight, while the British government breaks a promise on tax cuts, we ask, would the government here get away with it? Here to answer your questions. He's been described as the brain of Britain, former Justice of the UK Supreme Court, Jonathan Sumption. Greens Deputy Leader, Mehreen Faruqi. Minister for Social Services, Amanda Rishworth. Former Socceroo and Chair of Professional Footballers Australia, Francis Awaritefe. And Group Chief Economist from the National Australia Bank, Alan Oster. Please make them welcome. Don't forget, you can live stream us around the country on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. You know that Quandra is the hashtag, so please get involved. Let's get started tonight. Here's Dean Cooper.
Andrew Thorburns' beliefs are not relevant to his role as Essendon CEO. It's his actions and behaviours that should be judged. We're going down a slippery slope if people cannot hold down a job or pursue their career based on their religious or moral beliefs. If we put the spotlight on everyday Aussies, a lot of people would be out of work. What's your thoughts?
Alan Oster, you know Andrew Thorburn. He was your CEO, wasn't he, before?
Professionally, I know him. So Chief Economist obviously has to talk to the CEO. I don't know him in the social sense. When I used to work with him, he always seemed to be very professional. He put a lot of emphasis on diversity and all those sort of things. So my sort of response is, I really don't know. And I think that is really a question that should be asked to the Essendon Football Club. But
you didn't see where his faith beliefs may have crossed over into his work life?
When I was there, I had no idea that he had strong religious beliefs. And in the bank, you sort of don't know that anyway. I think it's appropriate you don't know.
God and mammon, they say, don't they? Mehreen Faruqi, one of the things that Andrew Thorburn has raised here is the concern that, you know, as Dean said, is this a slippery slope? Should people of faith now fear for their employment? Do you share that concern?
In any workplace, no one should be discriminated for the religious beliefs that they hold. But also, in a workplace, no one has free rein to express bigoted or hateful views as well. I think in this particular case, we have to separate out, I think, everyday Australians working in a workplace to someone who is a leader in their church.
He hadn't said this, and of course the comments had happened before he was chair of the church. But as leader, does he hold a responsibility?
Of course, you are a leader of an organisation which has expressed kind of anti-choice, homophobic views. So, you know, you have to take responsibility for that. And now you are being, you know, asked to be the CEO or are a CEO of an organisation who has different values, an organisation which has had, you know, issues as the whole football industry in terms of racism and homophobia and other discrimination. And this organisation is trying to change for better, to be more inclusive, to be more respectful. So I think that's the difference here. If your values clash or the two positions that you hold, their organisations' values clash, then you have to pick one or the other. I think that's what we are experiencing here.
Jonathan Sumption, call on your legal expertise, and this also puts me in mind of what the philosopher Hannah Arendt talked about when she talked about the right to have rights. Who has the right to have rights?
I don't think this is actually a question of rights or a question which law helps one to answer. Personally, I completely agree with the premise of Dean's question. I think that the only relevant question is whether he would be good at the job that he was appointed to. As I understand it, the reason why he was thought to be objectionable was his views on abortion. Abortion is one of the great moral issues of our time. I personally strongly believe that there should be a regulated right of abortion, but I'm certainly not going to say that those who take a morally different view are in some way objectionable or can't be employed by somebody whose function is nothing to do with abortion one way or the other.
Dean, just from the tone of your question, you're concerned that this could spread. Do you share that belief that there are others now who may be vulnerable?
I just think we need to be able to separate your beliefs from... He has a role as an Essendon CEO. It's completely irrelevant what his personal beliefs. I just think, yeah, slippery slope that you can... It shouldn't really be considered. I guess the Essendon CEO is a high-profile case, so... but there'll be a lot of people, if you looked at any workforce, that have similar views as Andrew. Does it prevent them fulfilling their role? I'd argue it doesn't.
Amanda Rishworth, does this bring us back to the question about the need for a religious discrimination or anti-discrimination bill, which of course we'd seen debated in the previous parliament and that didn't get anywhere? Does this now increase the urgency to return to that?
Well, I don't know if this specific case suggests that we need to return to this, but I do think we do have to send a strong message, whether it is about sexual orientation, whether it's about race, or whether it is about being able to hold religious beliefs. There should be a right not to be discriminated against, and that right is very important. I think, though, as we talk about rights, there can be a tension between, for example, the right to free speech and how and when that's used and where it crosses over to how it affects others. And I think that's always, when we talk about rights, there's also about a responsibility of how we make others feel.
The problem is, and we saw this with the debate around religious discrimination before, is how do you square that circle? How do you meet all of the demands for inclusion and recognition of rights? For instance, now would someone at a religious school have the right to employ only someone who adheres to those religious beliefs?
Well, that actually does exist across our country, that teachers at religious schools can say that they would like to employ employees that have aligned values. So the circumstance that you talk around values being aligned actually does occur currently. But I think we have to be really clear that people do have the right to hold different beliefs. That is an important part of our multicultural country, our multi-faith country. But we also have a responsibility of how we all take personal responsibility in making sure we think of others as we go about what we do.
Of course, Jonathan, you know, in your country, it's a very diverse country. You also have an equality bill, don't you, a human rights bill. Is that enough to provide the protection necessary?
Yes, it is. In fact, we recently had a big case on this very subject, which concerned differences, very violently expressed differences of opinion about gender reassignment. And our Court of Appeal has ruled that that discrimination in employment on account of a person's beliefs on that subject is forbidden by statute. I personally applaud that decision because I think that we have got to learn to be tolerant of other people's opinions. People in an educated and diverse society are never going to agree about all that much. And life becomes impossible if we are not prepared to tolerate views that we strongly disagree with.
Having views that you disagree with is one thing. I think we all agree that people should be able to express views. However, when they cross over to the line of inciting violence or hate, and as we know, even with regard to, I mean, a lot of lay people talk about rights, and as if the right to free speech, for example, is absolute. It's not. It's always qualified. It's not an absolute right, and for those reasons. And so this is why I think, and I also sort of the language you're using about his been leaving his job because of his association with the church. It's not the association with the church per se that's caused
It's the
this.
beliefs.
It's the beliefs. It's the views.
He made a choice. Is that the way these things should be dealt with, Francis? Is there a choice here? Do you end the association with the church, or do you end your employment with Essendon?
Well,
is that what it comes down to?
Ultimately, it comes down to a clash of values, and I think that those two values, those two organisations, are completely incompatible. And one, you can't, it's a sense of cognitive dissonance if you just say, well, that person can hold those. A person can be in those two organisations, and yet be leading an organisation which may have propagated. Discriminatory or bigotry views, and then on the other hand, you're working for an organisation that says it's inclusive and diverse. Those two things are not compatible. So there has to be a choice here.
And that's the choice he made. Let's hear now from Sharif Hagay.
Last month, Senator Pauline Hanson tweeted saying that to Senator Faruqi that to peace off back to Pakistan. So as a university professor, I was wondering, is it safe actually for me to actually use that, exactly what she said, to use it with my colleagues, to my students? Will I actually still have my job?
Mehreen.
Someone like me has heard that said to me hundreds and hundreds of times in my 30 years in Australia. My kids have heard it while they were growing up in school, university, at workplaces. And I know that so many people who contacted me after Senator Hanson said that to me have told me how triggered they have felt. Because what this does is it really pokes and prods at the scars that we already carry because of the incessant racism that is piled on upon us. For me, it was humiliating. It was insulting. It really does challenge my belonging to a place that I have called home for 30 years. And I don't think it would be tolerated in any workplace. And I've spoken to many others as well. I have worked in local government. I've worked in a university as well. I've worked in a consulting firm. And I can tell you, they were all, I'm a civil engineer, so they were all very male-dominated white spaces. But I can tell you, in none of those spaces have I been made to feel as I feel in my current workplace. And none of those workplaces would have tolerated that. And there would have been consequences for those people who might have said that to another colleague. But here, in Parliament, zero consequence. And Senator Hanson has been doing this for decades as well, without any sanctions, without any accountability. So what I tried to do, and what the Greens tried to do with the censure motion, was to try and hold Senator Hanson to account. But that censure motion was watered down to actually remove the censure. So what kind of message does that send to the rest of the community? Here we are, the so-called leaders in this country who are not willing to call out racism and hold the perpetrator accountable. I think it sends a horrible message, and it basically gives free rein. It actually legitimizes then what happens in sporting clubs or sporting arenas, and what happened last week. With the fascist symbols and the disrespect, acknowledgement to country.
We're going to get to that, Francis.
Yeah, I very much I really do feel for you, because I think that, and again, I think I come at this from the perspective of somebody who is a British citizen, but is also an Australian, a dual Australian national. And if you're telling, and I'm an Australian national, so if somebody says to me, piss off back to where you come from, I'm Australian. Senator Faruqi's kids are probably born here, raised here. They might have brown skin, but if you're telling them to piss off, just think about the underlying assumptions you're making about that person. You're telling them that they don't belong here because they happen to have a brown skin. And I said in the UK, I grew up in that sort of environment where people, black, Asian, were being told constantly to piss off back to where they came from. We had, not long ago, some years ago, we had a famous Australian an ex-Olympian, tell Mark Philippoussis to go back to where his parents came from. I mean, not Mark Philippoussis.
Nick Kyrgios.
Nick Kyrgios. Sorry, I'm thinking about the wrong guy. Yeah, Nick Kyrgios was told to piss off back to where his parents came from, and he's born here. You know, so so if you cannot see the underlying assumptions there, it's just. What can I say?
Amanda, the question really went to a double standard, didn't it? You're saying that you wouldn't be able to do this in your workplace, Sharif. Why is this allowed in Parliament?
Well, firstly, I wanted to say to Mehreen personally, I'm really sorry you had to endure that, because I can only imagine that if a senator of Australia is enduring it, in fact, it's happening right across the country. And the comments you made, and I can't pretend to understand what it's like, but I have spoken with people that have said that it is very triggering to that sense of belonging. So someone that's been elected to the Australian Senate is in that position is difficult. Of course, we've got to call it out. And I think Senator Penny Wong, who has also experienced, did a blistering speech that really did call it out. But we've got to constantly be calling it out.
But the censure motion, just sorry to interrupt to go to Mehreen's point, was watered down. Is that calling it out?
Well, I think if anyone listened to what Penny Wong said in her speech, it was blistering. It didn't try and hide the fact that this was racist. It was completely unacceptable and shouldn't be targeted at anyone in Australia, let alone a senator of the Australian Parliament, but shouldn't be tolerated by anyone, because it is triggering and it is very... It doesn't bring people together. And I think Senator Hanson is elected to the Australian Parliament, but we can all call out bad behaviour, and I'm doing that tonight, and I think it was done in the Senate as well.
Well, words do matter, and I'm really appreciative of the words that Senator Wong used, but actions matter more. And the action for that day was that today we hold this racism to account. And that did not happen. So I have followed on, and I have made a complaint to the Human Rights Commission on the basis of racial discrimination.
Sure, if you wanted to ask something else?
Yeah, I think to me, it's double standard, and I feel like it's very, very unjust. Like, someone is just taking an exemption for doing, but if I did the same action, I'm totally going to be treated differently. So yeah, calling out is a good thing, but definitely action is totally different.
We'll go now to our next question. We'll bring in Laura Dent.
What are the reasons behind this emerging neo-Nazism as well as the broader racism within sport? Or is the community instead more aware and conscious of this behaviour and willing to call it out?
Francis, referring to a football game that I think you were at the other weekend, did you see anything? Or?
No, I didn't, and that was a strange thing for many of us in that corporate area, if you like. There was nothing. I mean, in fact, I wasn't at the very kick-off of the game because I was still in the corporate area having a chat. I was speaking to the Chief Executive of Football Australia at the time, and then when we both left about a minute or two into the kick-off, I started getting messages around what was happening around the booing or the noise, the disrespect of the welcome to country. And and then the calls came in, and then it was really the next day that I got a sense of what the full gravity of the situation was, because even on that night we didn't know anything about the Nazi salutes, and so it was the next day that it all came out. I mean, that was in the afternoon when I actually saw that whole thing, and I went, "Man, this is worse than what I thought."
And what does it? The question was also broader, wasn't it, Laura, to the question of sport in general? And once again, there's an investigation in the AFL that Mehreen had mentioned about allegations of racism. Not the first time the AFL has been in this situation. You've played sport around the world. You know the level of racism that can happen in sport as well. Is sport just a mirror of society, or is there something else at play?
Oh, look, I think sport reflects society. However, it's also is a force for good, and I think that that with what's happening at the moment, there's no doubt that if we look around the world with the rise of extreme right extremism, and far-right politicians. There's no doubt that it's having an effect on everyday discourse and the way that people are able to express themselves in public. And it's really, and for those people that do have the propensity to be racist, it's given them the opportunity and the encouragement to go out there and express those emotions, and so people are So I think we're seeing more and more of that stuff. There's no doubt that the political milieu, in terms of what's happening now, is contributing significantly to what we're seeing now in terms of extremism.
Alan Oster, I'll bring you in on this. I know it's outside your bailiwick as an economist, but listening to the conversation, we've had a conversation about someone being abused in the Parliament and told to go back to where they came from in pretty appalling language. We've discussed the question of faith and faith in the public square, and now racism. I wonder if your thoughts about, in general, about what this says at this moment and the contest of ideas, radicalism, racism that we see in our societies.
Well, one of the things in economics that we look at when we see this, we sort of say, what's causing this? And we sort of don't know, but there is a few theories out there, and one of them that I think is quite interesting is that if you look over the last 20 years, and you don't count the very top end of the income distribution and don't count the very bottom end of the income distribution, most people in the OECD world actually had very little real wages growth. And so the sort of then philosophy is, well, the guys in the middle will probably say, well, stuff it. This mob, whoever they are, hasn't done any good for me, so why don't I try something else? And that's why you sort of look at what you saw in Europe, in the rise of the right, Brexit a little bit, Trump. It's happening everywhere. So I would go back and say, what could have caused that? And my sort of, I can't prove it. I don't think anybody can prove it. But I do think the idea that a population generally thinks they're not getting anything out of the government, why not try something different?
Well, we know that often sits at the root, Jonathan Sumption, of radicalisation, doesn't it, when you see inequalities in society. Alan mentioned Brexit, and there was a lot of commentary at the time around whether there was a racial motivation to Brexit. To what extent, if any, do you believe that was a factor?
I don't think it was a significant factor. There are all sorts of more or less patronising explanations of why most of my fellow citizens, I think unwisely, voted to leave the EU. But I think the true explanation is the one that was written on the tin. They wanted to take control. That was an illusion, because you don't take control by leaving the most powerful trading bloc in the world and isolating yourself in a corner of Europe. But that was what they genuinely thought. I don't believe in any of the facile explanations like post-imperial nostalgia, class hatred, racial hatred, xenophobia. That was no doubt true of some people, but the great majority voted for exactly the reasons that they were invited by the Leave campaign to vote.
One of the things that we did see was, and I think we saw it also in the election of Donald Trump in the United States, was a geographical divide. There was a pithy phrase that one of the writers in the UK came up with, the somewheres and anywheres, that the somewheres who were rooted in a sense of place, or particularly in rural areas, were more inclined to vote to leave. How much does that split along the lines that Alan was talking about, lines of a growing inequality gap, rich and poor?
I think that obviously it does to some extent, because the poorest members of British society are the ones that gained least. In a period of 25 or so years before the referendum, there had been continuously rising prosperity of the nation at large, but it was very unequally distributed. I think that people are prepared to tolerate a significant amount of inequality, provided that everybody is doing well. But there was a period of some years before the referendum when, frankly, incomes at the bottom end of the income scale were frozen, while those at the top end were taking off in a big way. And that's a large part of what lies behind the British government's recent U-turn on the subject of modifying the tax rule.
Which we are going to get to.
I wanted to ask a question, though. I mean, if that's the case, how does that explain the fact that, say, for example, let's look at the United States in the last two elections, Trump in 2016 when he and voted in 2020, where by a majority, a significant majority of white people voted for Trump. But I mean, if you look at you're talking about the working class as well, the ones who were harmed or would have been harmed by Trump's policies. Whereas when you look at the demographic votes in terms of black people and Latinos, I mean, the black women voted something like 96%, and the black men was 92%.
So you're saying there is a racial element.
So how do they explain it? Because they're economically deprived. I mean, a lot of those people, and black people and people from those demographics, they have the worst in terms of the economic and social indicators. So they're the ones who are harmed the most. But yet they're not voting for a fascist.
No, but I mean, I think that there are some similarities between those who supported Trump and those who supported Brexit. But it's important not to overstate the similarities. I mean, Trump was and is an overt racist. He never made any real secret about that. And so the issue was very much more obviously on the table. And I've no doubt that among some British people who voted to leave, similar motives applied. What I don't accept was that it was a decisive factor, because I really don't think that it was.
I think it's really important to point out that while obviously there is economic inequality, it was rising, but these figures like Trump, like Boris, like Bolsonaro, actually have used those insecurities for their benefit to inflame division and fear against racial minorities in those countries. It's an anti-immigrant sentiment that they have played on because they had no policies to offer to actually tackle the inequalities that there are. And I, for one, am glad that, they are, two of them are gone now. Bolsonaro hopefully is on his way out. I think Scott Morrison tried to do it here, become a mini Trump, and, that government is out as well. So I don't think we should downplay this. I think this is a real factor in how racism, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination are actually rising in this country as well.
I mean, I would go to the point, though, and your question was about sport and racism in sport. And I think it would be naive for us to think that this is a new phenomena. I think there has been elements when you hear Adam Goode's story, for example. I mean, I think no one... and when I saw that documentary, I just... so many people didn't realise it was happening to him like it was. And I was really... Well, you did, yeah. But a lot of people didn't. And so I think for us, the question is, how do we make sure that people in sporting organisations, those that might... where there is a power difference, you think...
So how do you do that? If sporting bodies are failing... And there have already been calls for the federal government to step in and take more of a role, particularly in investigating this and applying some real penalties. Is that what you're saying needs to be done?
And I was really pleased that our sports minister announced on Friday a unit, an expanded unit within the Sports Integrity Commission for people to make complaints, to get advice and to do investigations. Obviously, it always has to be done with the permission of the person that's experienced it. But I think it is really important that we do have an independent place for people to be, because there is that power difference. How do you go to your coach or someone high up in a club if you're a junior person? So I think it is really important. There is a role for independence.
Laura, thank you for your question. It was a good discussion. Plenty to get through tonight, including the economic pressures on people's minds. On that, let's go to Suzanne Newton.
Thank you. Amanda, I'm expecting my first child in the next few days, and despite having good jobs, my partner and I are feeling the pinch of interest rate rises and cost of living. Now that you're in government, will you reconsider the stage 3 tax cuts so I can be reassured my child will experience the same or better quality of life his parents have?
Look, thank you very much for that question and all the best for the birth of your child. Look, it is a really difficult economy that we've inherited. We've got a situation where we've got rising interest rates, we've got rising inflation, and a significant government debt. And really, the debt and the budget we were left was a mess. And
so how can you afford to have tax cuts for people on $200,000?
Well, we are going through. In a responsible way, looking at every bit of spending, every bit of how we tackle tax. For example, we've said we want to focus on multinational tax. But when we look at what we spend, and we've got to be focused on our people, we've got to be focused on productivity and what's good for the economy. So the global circumstances are changing. We're very alive to that. And I think what you'd expect
Is that a no, though? It's a very long answer to what was a very simple question.
Stan, what you would expect of us with a budget coming up, and I know you'd love me to announce the whole budget here tonight. I can't do that. I'll leave that to the Treasurer. But what we're doing is going through the budget process, keeping these very difficult circumstances, taking action where we can, including, for example, childcare and making childcare more affordable in this country, medicines more affordable. We've got to take responsible, targeted action. That's what the Treasurer and the Finance Minister is doing right now, and we'll continue to do that and keep the economic circumstances in place.
Alan, I'll come to you on the economics in just a moment. Suzanne, does that answer your question at all?
I think it is time to reconsider. So we're in a situation now where things are changing rapidly. Things are getting harder. We've just seen in the UK that they haven't done the tax cuts. So I think it's absolutely time to reconsider now. And the things that you're talking about will be a lot easier if you don't do the stage 3 tax cuts.
Suzanne, I think you did say your baby's due in a few days. I think it's due today, isn't it?
Today is the due date, yes.
Today is the due. So good luck. Good luck with that as well. Alan, is it time to scrap them? Is it bad economics?
It's very difficult. I think you need to put... everyone says phase 3 tax cuts. Look what happened in the UK. These are very, very different circumstances. And if I'll sort of give you some numbers, but where I'm going to come to, I think it's a political issue, pure on that. And it's up to how the government does it. So what happened in the UK very quickly is you had a new government came in. They announced a package that was not expected, not independently valued. They've got an independent office that sort of does it, so it wasn't there. Half of the package hasn't actually been announced. So anything on what are they going to do to saving hasn't been announced. It was basically 2 bits. One was taxes. Most of those taxes haven't changed. It's just the top end. And also it was this attempt to stop the prices of electricity going through. And so what happened was the government essentially said, I'm going to go off and borrow 3% of GDP at a time when their government was running a current account deficit of -8 and they had higher levels of debt. And so you had very high inflation, so people in Australia don't realise what you've got in the UK. Bank of England's talking about 13% increase in inflation. Most private sector economists are talking 15 to 20. Okay, and so what the bond market said is, hang on, you guys are doing exactly the reverse of what the Bank of England's trying to do. And so what then happened was the bond dealers got in and said, this just means Bank of England's got to go even higher. That is a very different situation to what we've got here.
But the headwinds are there, aren't they? If we look around the rest of the world, and you've talked about the inflation numbers there, if that's what's coming over the horizon, and we've got a wealth gap, and interest rates keep going up, we're potentially going into a recession ourselves, aren't we?
2024, before they even start.
But will we be in a recession by then?
Yeah. So the question about the recession, so I'm going to try and say the optimistic side, because we're always trying to be optimistic, okay? The optimistic thing to say is we're not overseas. Why? 3 things, 3 really important things. China has a vaccine that doesn't work against Omicron. So whenever they get it, they close it down. Secondly, you've got Europe where you've got the Russian gas situation, and if you want a statistic that's really going to scare you, they're trying to put a cap at £2,500 per annum. The average British consumer, after tax, earns £20,000. About 15% just to turn the lights on. Okay, so that is really a big issue. And then you've got central banks who are out there saying, I'm going to use inflation to get things down. And thing to remember about monetary policy, it takes at least 12 months to work.
Yeah. And we also know it's a very, and I want to bring Mehreen in just on the question of these tax cuts in just a minute, but we also know it's a very blunt instrument.
Yeah.
And right now, a lot of people are being hurt. We're not overseas, but we are in Australia.
Yeah.
We
And
do have
so-
a growing wealth gap, interest rates are going up, inflation is going up, and people are concerned
Wages
about
are going
their
down.
And wages are going down.
People are very worried about what's going to happen, and everyone seems to think economists just build these fancy models, and no, it's applied psychology within a framework of model. And what the sort of problem we've got is people say, oh, rates started to go up and nothing's happened. Things are still good. As a big bank, we can see that most people haven't actually got their notice yet or haven't started paying back. You know, they're going to be, even if rates just go up a little bit from here, they're going to be paying off on average $600 per month extra. That is coming. Then you've got also the fact there's a lot of people who took up those fixed loans and they roll over in the middle of next year. So we're going to have a hit to the economy. But we don't think it's going to go into a recession, provided you don't go too far in terms of pushing up rates.
Okay, well, let's go to Mehreen here. At a time when people are going to be paying higher interest rates, when they are concerned potentially about a recession, when they are paying more for food and for petrol and other necessities, is it justified to give people who are on $200,000 a year a $9,000 windfall, because that's how much they'll make with the tax cuts? So what would you be pushing for?
Well, absolutely not. And the Greens have been clear from day one. These taxes, stage 3 tax cuts, made no sense when they were introduced in 2019, and they make even less sense now. And the Greens were really the only party that voted against unwinding a progressive tax system. And, you know, we're sticking to that. As you said, Stan, we are in a place here where inequality is rising. We are in one of the worst housing crises that Australia has ever seen. People have to choose between paying rent or putting food on the table. People have to choose between, you know, paying rent or going to the doctor or the dentist. You know, in what world does it make sense to put more money, $244 billion worth of money, into the pockets of the richest? And also into the pockets of men? That is just going to turbocharge further economic inequality, further gender inequality. And to be really fair, you know, decades of neoliberal economics has done nothing for those most in need. Nothing has trickled down to them, where rivers of gold have flown and will continue to flow if these tax cuts go ahead. But, you know, there is a little bit of a ray of sunshine, I think, somewhere there. There is unrest in the Labour Party, it seems, and that's only
I don't know where you
on these tax cuts, on these well, you know, I've been reading the newspaper a little bit.
We're not done with the discussion about the economy.
But I think the pressure that is being put on the Labour government from literally everyone in the community, except probably the wealthiest, even some of the wealthiest are saying, we don't need these tax cuts. This is not the time to do it. It's just going to further turbocharge the, you know, if there are the storm clouds of a recession coming, that's what it's going to do. People are going to suffer more. So we've got to keep the pressure up, folks, and get Labour to commit to scrapping these tax cuts.
If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A. We're live with Jonathan Sumption, Mehreen Faruqi, Amanda Rishworth, Francis Awaritefe and Alan Oster. We are discussing the economic challenges so many of you are facing, so here's Sarah Guest.
In the UK, the poorest households are facing the difficult decision to heat or eat, whilst in Australia, 1 in 6 adults are struggling to get enough food, often having to make the decision between paying for their medicine and meals. We call ourselves the lucky country, and yet many cannot even afford food. What can Australia do to avoid the UK scenario, wherein up to 1 in 10 Britons must use charities in order to eat?
Jonathan, do you have any advice for us?
Well, I don't have any advice in an Australian context. I'd need to know a great deal more about the financial position of the Australian government and a lot of other economic factors in order to offer an opinion. What I can tell you is what not to do. It's what the British government
Is that what we've just watched
done.
over the past 2 weeks?
I mean, the logic, first of all, there are the tax package announced initially by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, even after the dropping of the reduction in the top rate of tax, involves very large reductions in tax. There's a reduction of a penny on the basic rate, which makes a much bigger difference than the reduction of 5% on the top rate, because there are many more people who pay it. There is a reduction in corporation tax, and there's a reduction in national insurance. That's a very, very big tax reduction even now. The big problem in the UK, and I just don't know whether this is a problem that Australia has, is that the entire logic behind these tax cuts is that they will improve productivity and stimulate growth. Now, most economists believe that tax cuts, by putting money into people's pockets, can sometimes have some effect in promoting growth.
Depends where that goes, of course.
But no serious economist that I'm aware of thinks that the cost of doing this will be recouped by the growth in question. That the increase in growth will be there, but it won't be nearly enough to compensate for the reduction in government revenue. In the case of the UK, we have very low unemployment. We have a very tight labour market. The industry is working at absolute capacity. There is a shortage of labour, partly due to the stopping of immigration from the European Union after we left the European Union. The position, therefore, is that there is very little capacity to increase the increased spending that might result from reducing taxes will not have the effect in increasing production, because we've hit the capacity limits already. It will simply go into inflation. So this is an economically illiterate policy, which all I can say is that whatever you do in Australia, don't do that.
Yeah, I think, so as we've seen with the current economic circumstances here, I mean, one of the things that's actually driving the inflation is not actually wages, it's actually the profits, it's corporate profits that are causing the rises in inflation. I mean, normally,
No,
Alan will...
it's not corporate.
Well, that's what the evidence is saying, that it's been driven by corporate profits, and because we can see that wages are stagnant or falling off, and so that's what's causing it. And in terms of the labour market itself, if you're going to boost the economy, we've gutted and weakened the bargaining power of workers all over the world through the industrial relations framework. So in terms of collective bargaining and the right, freedom of association to join unions, I mean, we see that, and we've seen that resurgence in the United States now. And also, another critical area is competition law, because the thing is, we've got, there's been a lot of consolidation and a lot of industries, and so these monopolists are able to actually control the market. And because there's only, when you only have a few corporate multinationals who control access to certain materials, raw materials or industries, they're able to control the price, and that's what's happening, and that's also fueling inflation. So, and that's a massive area that needs to be looked at in terms of competition law.
I might get a quick comment from Alan about what's driving inflation. I want to come to Amanda quickly.
So what's driving inflation is not domestic demand, fundamentally. What it is basically commodity prices, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. You've also had the issue of supply chain disruptions. You can't get the stuff. You know, we bought a dishwasher about 3 months ago. It's going to be delivered in December. So that pushes things up. So I actually have a bit of an issue about using monetary policy to stop that, because it's not going to do that. It will get the economy down a bit. I do have no problem with the idea of looking for extra tax somehow, because, you know, what you've got with personal and corporate tax is about 70% of the entire government's revenue. So they need to do different things. So they need to basically broaden the base. You won't like what I'm saying.
Let me just go quickly to Amanda.
Very quickly. But that goes against what you were saying earlier on about the argument you were having around the reluctance not to get rid of the 30% stage. Because if you're actually eroding your tax base by cutting tax, it goes against what you're saying now, because the two things don't square.
No, what I was saying before is I don't mind which way they go for phase
But you believe it's political, not economic?
I think it's basically now in a situation, it's been put into the forward estimates. People understand it there. You can say, OK, the main benefits are at the top end. They're the people that pay most of the tax.
But they don't spend a lot either.
Well, yes. And so one way, if you want to get... So the Laffer curve, which is what we were talking about before, nobody believes that you do these tax cuts, the growth goes faster and you get the money back.
That's fairy stuff.
It was called the Laffer curve, in the US. But you know, basically, what you want to do is get more income into the bottom end of the income distribution because they'll spend it. The top end of the income distribution
you've got the budget coming up, Amanda. So how do you do that, put more money into the hands of people who will spend it without that becoming inflationary?
Look, that's a really big challenge, and one of the first actions we took as a government was to support a rise in the minimum wage, because we do recognise that those on the minimum wage particularly have been falling behind, as well as other wages have just not kept up. But it goes to the point that you were making. We have had a focus on the productive economy. That's what our childcare policy is about. It's about supporting people with the cost of living, but it's also freeing up women particularly that have seen the cost of childcare as a barrier to going back into the labour market. Whether it is our big package we announced with the states and territories on training to make sure that our people, our human capital, our people have the skills to do the jobs, particularly in the care economy, which is crying out for workers, quite frankly, at the moment. So there is a number of the initiatives that we will have in our budget that is about supporting our people, but it is also not just putting $1 in and expecting $1 out. It is about the productive capacity, our future manufacturing policy about making more things here, having that security, but also growing those high technical jobs. That's all part of the solution, and that will be central to our budget.
I want to go
a few ideas, Stan. Could I say a few things?
Really quickly, because I do have to move on.
I think the question really was about how people are suffering at the moment with the cost of living crisis here and across the world. And, you know, I guess we could scrap the $244 billion of stage 3 tax cuts. We could introduce a super profits tax on big corporations. We could tax the billionaires, their fair share. We could get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. And then we can actually invest in the public services that people need, build the 1 million affordable homes that people need. Mental and dental health.
You have absolutely led us to our next question, because it is about housing. I want to go to Kat Watkins in Wagga via Skype. Hi, Kat.
Hi, Stan. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. Listen, I want to go to your move to Wagga. You've got a young family, as we can see. What you were hoping for, what you were hoping for when you moved to Wagga, and what the reality has been.
So we moved to Wagga in 2018, my partner and I. I'm just looking, I suppose, for something different, and both found jobs that we really enjoyed. And also a big bonus to the move was the cost of living. So we found an amazing house, cheaper than... So we moved from Newcastle to Wagga, and this amazing house that was very much within our budget. We've been here 5 years. Good jobs and a great community, just an absolutely fantastic community of friends that we've made and colleagues through our workplaces, and just, didn't intend to stay 5 years, but here we are, and I suppose here for a while.
Is the cost of living pressure now starting to hit?
So gradually the rent has increased, and that was originally maybe $10, $20 a year with every new lease, but the most recent lease went up $50, and that coincided with maternity leave and me working less, and then with all the interest rate hikes and cost of living it's been, I would say, probably harder.
So Kat, what's the question you'd like to put tonight about rental and more assistance for people with renting?
I suppose, we at the moment don't know how much our rent will increase on signing the next lease. So my question is what the current government intends to do if there are intentions to increase tenant protections, particularly placing caps on rental price increases so that people like us aren't priced out of their communities that are so important to them.
Amanda?
Well, look, tenant rules and laws are matters for state governments, but what the federal government has recognised is that there are terrible challenges with housing in this country. We've made a commitment where we're going forward on setting up a Future Australia Fund where we're actually going to build public housing, community housing. We want to partner with local councils and other organisations to build that housing, which is really important. So we see that as a really important part of it. We've also got a range of other schemes that we're looking at, but we see building more public housing as a really key part of that. And we've said we will partner, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's public housing, we see that as a critical part of the solution.
Jonathan, in the UK, I know in Europe and the US as well, there are caps on rental, aren't there, and protection for people who rent, who often rent very long time.
Very limited. Rent control is minimal. There is frankly only one way to make housing more affordable, and that is to build more houses. There's absolutely nothing else that will have any significant effect. In Australia, you at least have the advantage of relatively low density of population over the continent as a whole, and plenty of space. That's not, of course, the position in the UK, which is very densely populated, and planning laws have restricted the amount that we can build. The most serious aspect of this in the UK, we have actually a worse inequality problem than Australia, indeed a worse inequality problem than every country in the world apart from the United States, which is even worse than we are. Housing is part of that. And what is really appalling about this is the way in which the economic prosperity gap corresponds to the age gap. The young in the UK are disproportionately affected, particularly by housing policy. At the moment, the average first-time buyer is in his late 30s, and that's gone up from the late 20s a generation ago. It's a really serious problem. And our problem is we don't build enough houses. I don't know what the problem is in Australia, but building is the answer. It doesn't have to be public housing, but there's got to be more of it.
The situation is so bad in Australia that people are living in cars, they're living in tents, they're living in caravans, they're moving from motel to motel.
But why is that?
Can't. Because rents are sky high.
No, but rents are sky high for some reason.
Because housing is so expensive. And yes, I agree with you. We do need to build more public and affordable housing. In Australia, over the next 20 years, we need 1 million homes. And what the government has promised is literally nothing. I think it's 30,000 in the next some years.
But what's
it will
the obstacle?
not at all.
Yeah.
It will not at all meet any of the needs that are required. And I think federal governments can't just wash their hands off the responsibility of having any say in how rents are managed.
We
went with the proposal for the federal government to develop a national renters' rights standards that are strong. We also want this government to freeze rents for the next 2 years. That's how bad the situation is.
Okay, I'll bring in Francis and then go to Alan. Francis?
The 1 million homes that are needed to solve this crisis.
Yeah, I think the point is we understand the issue, but the problem is also what drives that, and it's policy, it's government policy around public housing, building enough public housing, and also policies such as negative gearing. And so if you incentivise people who have already got a home or got a couple of homes and they're buying 2, 3, 4, 5 houses, as some members of the Labor Party have, there's a whole bunch of them that are landlords. The issue is that that creates this perverse incentive which then leads to these shortages because, and that also leads to the rises in terms of especially now, in terms of the rents.
What are the economics around that, Alan? Because we know Bill Shorten took that to an election and lost, wanting to tinker with any sort of capital gain or negative gearing. Does that play into this?
I actually think one of the big issues in Australia is not income inequality, it's wealth inequality. Now, if you look at Australia, it's actually one of the lower countries in the world in terms of income distribution. But then as soon as you put wealth in, then we come really high. That says to me the critical issue is housing. And what typically has happened in the past has everybody sort of said, OK, we're going to attack this on the income side or the demand side. And so what they do is they give first homeowners some extra money, which they then just take it out and bid it up even higher. Yeah. Nobody looks on the supply side. And there's two really important issues there. Number one issue is the states own or restrict the amount of land that's available, and they put a lot of taxes, if you like, on developers who then just immediately pass it on. So you need to get the states to agree lower taxes on the land and release more of it. But of course, as soon as they release more of it, house prices don't go up so much and they don't get so much revenue. And then finally, the other thing you really need to do, and this one I agree with really strongly, why the hell don't we have a lot more public housing? I mean, it is really, you build the houses, you get it's a big multiplier, you get the economy going really strongly, and the government can afford it. Now, people say we've got a lot of debt. We actually don't. By international standards. Yeah. So if we had to, we could afford to do, that would be very productive.
Kat, it was a great question. Someone's now resting very comfortably, I think, after enjoying his meal. Thank you so much, Kat. It's a beautiful place, Wagga. I'll be out there on the weekend. So enjoy it. Might see you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Let's finish tonight's discussion. Here's Madonna Quixley.
Thanks, Dan. Given the complex, conflicted situations represented here tonight and Lord Sumption's knowledge of history and the situation in Ukraine, how close does he think we are to World War III, and what can we do in our own lives to avert it?
Well, we can't do anything in our own lives to avert it. And it would be a bold man who tried to predict exactly what Mr. Putin was going to do. He is not the most rational or the most consistent or the most predictable actor on the world stage. If I had to guess, I would say that his threat to use nuclear weapons is a bluff because he knows that the consequences for Russia would be appalling, and I'm assuming that he would, if he does choose to use nuclear weapons, it would be low-grade battlefield so-called munitions rather than intercontinental ballistic missiles. The latter would plainly be a disaster from which no one would gain. But it seems to me that the prospect of retaliation and the likelihood that that would increase the tempo of the conventional war will probably deter him from doing it. But I may be assuming a degree of rationality in this man, which just isn't there. In the late 1930s, a lot of people said that Hitler wouldn't invade Eastern Europe because it would be a crazy thing to do. Well, it was a crazy thing to do, and he did it. And that's the situation we're in. I certainly think that the West, and certainly Europe, cannot afford to allow Putin to take over the Ukraine. Russia has been a predatory autocracy for 3 centuries. It has always considered itself to have a special degree of entitlement in Eastern Europe. If he is allowed to take over the Ukraine, it cannot be assumed that he will stop there, because the whole of Europe, of Eastern Europe and much of Central Europe, is land which at one stage or another in its history, Russia has coveted. In one of the most telling moments of a famous speech that he delivered at the end of last year, Putin cited as the great model for rulers of Russia the 18th century Tsarina of Russia, Catherine the Great. That was a very interesting statement. Catherine the Great swallowed up most of Poland and large parts of what are now Austria and the states to the east of it. And I think that we must assume that unless he gets a bloody nose on Ukraine, that will be his next sale.
Madonna, I don't know if that's put your mind at rest. I think the short answer is we were in a perilous situation. We have to wonder what Vladimir Putin is going to do next, but certainly a good question. We will no doubt come back to that question in future programmes as well. I want to thank you all for tonight. That's all the time we have. Thanks to our panel, Jonathan Sumption, Mehreen Faruqi, Amanda Rishworth, Francis Awaritefe and Alan Oster. Thank you to those of you here and at home for driving the conversation. We almost had a Q&A baby, Susanna, but good luck in the days ahead. And next week we'll be live in Sydney. You'll have the chance to put your questions to, among others, consumer advocate and environmental activist Erin Brockovich. That'll be a treat. Yes, the real Erin Brockovich, not the movie. Was it Julia Roberts? Yeah, not Julia Roberts. That story, of course, is brought to life by Julia Roberts in that feature film, so it'll be a real chance to sit down and put those questions to Erin. Head to our website. You can register to be in the audience. Until then, thanks for your questions again. Thanks for the answers. Good night.